The fabric of my favorite cardigan is thinning at the elbows, a soft, pelasted gray that matches the way I've felt for the last decade. To my family, I am a permanent fixture of the house, as unremarkable as the baseboards and just as silent. For 30 years, I've absorbed their moods, ironed their mistakes, and vanished into the background of my own life, while my husband David built his empire on the back of my quiet sacrifices. They see a woman who has outlived her usefulness, a burden in a faded sweater. They have no idea that the empire is crumbling, and I am the only one holding the keys to the new one. I need to know what happened. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, please subscribe, like, and comment below. Your support helps these stories of silent strength reach those who need them most. How much of yourself can you give away before there is nothing left to bury? The steam from the pot of pot roast rose in a thick, savory cloud, fogging my glasses. I didn't wipe them. I liked the blur. It softened the sharp edges of the dining room, the mahogany table that cost more than my first car, the silver-plated candle holders that I polished every first Sunday of the month, and the faces of the 3 people who sat there, waiting to be served. "Martha, the salt," David said. He didn't look up from his phone. He never looked up anymore. To David, I was a series of automated tasks. I provided salt. I provided clean shirts. I provided a listening ear for his grievances about the firm, though he never asked about mine. I set the salt shaker down beside his hand. My fingers brushed his sleeve, but he didn't flinch or acknowledge the touch. He was deep in a text chain, his thumb flicking rhythmically. At 62, David still had the aggressive energy of a man half his age, a shark who believed the water belonged to him by birthright. "Mom, did you get those shirts back from the cleaners?" Julian asked. My son sat to David's right, a carbon copy of his father, right down to the expensive watch and the slight permanent crease of irritation between his eyebrows. He was 32, lived in a condo downtown that I had decorated, and still dropped his laundry off at my house every Tuesday. "They're in the hallway, Julian, pressed and hung," I said quietly. My voice felt raspy, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. "Thanks," he muttered, already turning to Claire. Claire was Julian's wife of 3 years. She was a woman who treated life like a curated gallery, and I was the one piece of furniture that didn't fit the aesthetic. She sat primly, her eyes scanning the table with a practiced, judgmental squint. She reached out, her manicured nail pointing toward my arm. "Martha, honey," she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine pity that made my skin crawl. "Is that the same cardigan you wore to the Christmas brunch? The wool is practically transparent at the sleeves. It's a bit depressing, isn't it? We're having the partners over next week. You can't be seen in that. It looks like you've given up." I looked down at the gray wool. It was comfortable. It was warm. It didn't demand anything from me. "I like this sweater, Claire. It belonged to my mother." Claire sighed, a long, theatrical sound. She looked at David. "David, really, we've talked about this. It's about the family image. If people see Martha looking like a charity case, they'll start asking questions about the firm's stability. Perception is everything in logistics." David finally looked up, his blue eyes cold and transactional. He looked at me, not as his wife of 35 years, but as a line item on a budget. "She's right, Martha. Take some money from the household account. Buy something appropriate. You're becoming a bit of an eyesore. It's not like you have anything else to do with your day besides shop and cook." "I don't need new clothes, David," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was beginning to thud with a slow, heavy rhythm. "It's not a request," David said, returning to his phone. "Julian, tell her about the restructuring." Julian cleared his throat, leaning forward. "Right. So Sterling Logistics is hitting a bit of a transition phase. The board is looking at overhead. Dad and I have been talking, and honestly, Mom, this house is a lot of work for you. The cleaning, the taxes, the maintenance. We think it's time to look at those luxury senior suites over at the Willows. You'd have your own little place, but they handle everything. No more old sweaters, no more heavy pots. The room went very still. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a sound I usually found comforting. Now, it sounded like a countdown. You want me to move out of my home? I asked. Our home, David corrected. And it's a strategic move, Martha. If we sell this place now, the equity can be funneled back into the firm to shore up the acquisition defenses. We're being circled by a conglomerate, Vanguard Group. They're aggressive. We need to be lean. We need to be mobile. And where would you go, David? I asked. I'll keep a suite at the club for a while, close to the office, he said dismissively. It's just business. You've always said you wanted less to clean. Well, here's your wish. I see, I said. I stood up and began clearing the plates, even though they were only half finished. Hey, I wasn't done with that, Julian complained. I didn't stop. I moved with a mechanical precision I had perfected over decades. I took the plates to the kitchen, the porcelain clacking softly. Behind me, I heard Claire whisper, "See? She's getting forgetful, detached. It's definitely time for the Willows. She's becoming a burden on all of us." I stood at the sink, my back to them. I looked out the window at the dark backyard, the garden I had planted with my own hands, the roses that were currently dormant in the winter chill. They thought I was losing my mind. They thought I was a failing asset. They didn't know that 3 months ago, my father had passed away in a quiet hospice in Vermont. They didn't know that he had never trusted David. My father, the silent founder of the very conglomerate David was so terrified of, had left his majority shares not to a trust, not to a board, but to me. I wasn't just a wife in a second-hand cardigan. I was the majority owner of Vanguard Group. And tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., David and Julian had a meeting with the new president of the parent company to plead for their professional lives. "Martha," David called from the dining room. "The coffee? Are we getting coffee or not?" I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. I looked at the transparent wool of my sleeves. I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. The silence I had maintained for 30 years wasn't a prison anymore. It was a weapon. "Coming, David," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard plastic of the flash drive that held the new organizational charts for Sterling Logistics. My name was at the top. Their names were highlighted in red under a column labeled Immediate Termination/Redundant Assets. I poured the coffee into the chipped mugs they hated, my hand perfectly still. The morning sun hit the kitchen floor in sharp, unforgiving slats. It highlighted every speck of dust I hadn't reached and the faint, permanent scuff marks near the pantry where Julian used to kick his heels as a child. I watched the light, my hands submerged in lukewarm dishwater. David's footsteps were heavy on the stairs, the sound of a man who believed the floorboards should be honored to feel his weight. He entered the kitchen already cinching his silk tie, his face tight with the kind of stress he wore like a badge of importance. "Where's my blue folder, Martha? The one with the quarterly projections," he barked, not looking at me. He was scanning the counter, moving a stack of mail as if he expected the folder to be hiding under a utility bill. "It's on the sideboard, David, next to your briefcase. I put a fresh pen inside, the one you like," I said. He didn't say thank you. He grunted, moving toward the sideboard. Julian will be here in 10 minutes. We have the Vanguard meeting at 9. This is the biggest day for Sterling since the IPO, and I'm going in half blind because their new president refused to meet with my consultants first. I'm sure you'll make a lasting impression, I said, my voice carefully neutral. I dried my hands on a tea towel, one with a faded embroidery of a rooster that Julian had gifted me for Mother's Day 15 years ago. He'd forgotten to take the price tag off then. He'd forgotten the day entirely last year. The doorbell rang. It wasn't a guest's ring. It was the sharp, impatient double tap of someone who owned the place. Julian walked in, looking polished and sharp, carrying a leather folio. Beside him, Claire trailed in, already checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. "Morning, Dad," Julian said, his voice vibrating with nervous energy. "Ready to face the lions?" "Ready as I'll ever be," David replied. Julian turned to me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not affection, but a sort of clinical pity. He reached into his folio and pulled out a glossy, thick brochure. He slid it across the granite island toward me. "Mom, while we're out today, I want you to really look through this," he said. "Claire and I did a site visit at the Willows yesterday afternoon. They have a ceramic studio, a garden club. You wouldn't have to worry about the winter freeze killing your roses anymore. They have professionals for that." I looked down at the brochure. The cover featured a woman who looked nothing like me. A woman with perfectly coiffed white hair, laughing over a game of bridge. She looked like someone who had agreed to be retired. "I'm not finished with my roses, Julian," I said softly. "Martha, don't be difficult," Claire chimed in, leaning against the counter. She picked up my chipped mug, looked at the rim with a grimace, and set it back down. "The house is starting to smell like old wood and pot roast. It's heavy. Julian and I want to list the property by next month. The market is peaking. If we wait, you're just sitting on capital that David needs to save the company." Sitting on capital. They spoke about my home, the place where I had nursed Julian through scarlet fever and held David through his father's funeral, as if it were a clogged pipe in a basement. "I've lived here for 30 years, I said, more to myself than to them. "And you've done a great job," Julian said, patting my hand in a way that felt like he was dismissing a toddler. "But let's face it, Mom. You're tired. You're wearing clothes that are falling apart. You forgot to pick up the dry cleaning twice last month. We're just looking out for you." I hadn't forgotten the dry cleaning. I had simply stopped prioritizing Julian's vanity over my own rest. But I let them believe the lie. It was easier to be a ghost than a person who had to defend her existence. "Go to your meeting," I said, pulling my hand back. "You don't want to be late for the Vanguard, President." "She's right," David said, checking his watch. "Let's go. Martha, don't forget the plumber is coming at 11 for the guest bath. Make sure he doesn't overcharge us. You know how they see an older woman and think, easy target." I watched them leave. I stood at the window and watched David's silver sedan pull out of the driveway, followed by Julian's aggressive black SUV. They drove away with the confidence of men who thought the world was a map they had drawn themselves. The silence that followed was thick and absolute. I waited exactly 5 minutes. Then I walked upstairs. I didn't go to the master bedroom I shared with David, where his discarded pajamas lay like a shed skin on the floor. I went to the guest room, the one I had quietly claimed as my own 6 months ago under the guise of my snoring. I opened the closet. Tucked behind a row of David's old winter coats was a garment bag I had purchased in the city 3 weeks ago. I zipped it open. Inside was a suit of charcoal silk, tailored so precisely it felt like armor. I took off the gray cardigan. I felt the cool air hit the transparent elbows of my old life. I folded the sweater neatly, it had served its purpose, and placed it on the bed. I dressed slowly. I put on the pearls my father had given me when I graduated college, the ones David told me were too traditional for his firm's galas. I did my hair, pinning it back into a sharp, professional chignon that highlighted the bones of my face, bones that were still strong, still there beneath the soft mask of mother. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. For the first time in a decade, I didn't see a burden. I saw the majority shareholder of the Vanguard Group. I picked up my phone. There was one message from my father's attorney, Sarah Jenkins. "The board is assembled, Martha. They are expecting the new president at 9:15. Your security clearance is active." I grabbed my keys. Not the house keys, but the key to the private town car I had hired to wait 2 blocks away. I didn't want the neighbors seeing me leave like this. Not yet. As I walked through the kitchen, I saw the brochure for the Willows lying on the counter. I picked it up, walked to the trash can, and let it drop. I stepped out of the front door and locked it. The air was crisp, smelling of impending rain and wet earth. I didn't look back at the house. I had spent 30 years absorbing the blows of their indifference. I had been the shock absorber for David's ego and the safety net for Julian's failures. I had been silent because I thought love required it. But as I stepped into the back of the black town car, I realized that silence isn't just an absence of sound. It's a space where you can hear the enemy's footsteps before they even know they're being hunted. "Vanguard Plaza," I told the driver. "And please, take the scenic route. I want to arrive exactly 5 minutes late." I wanted them to be sitting in that boardroom, sweating, wondering who held their lives in their hands. I wanted David to have his pitch polished to a mirror shine, only to see his own reflection shatter. The lobby of Vanguard Plaza was a cathedral of glass and brushed steel, designed to make the individual feel small and the corporation feel eternal. As I stepped through the revolving doors, the click of my heels on the polished marble sounded like a rhythmic pulse. It was a sound I hadn't made in a very long time. For years, I had worn soft-soled slippers and sensible flats, the kind of shoes that allowed me to move through the house without disturbing David's phone calls or Julian's naps. I had learned to walk without weight. But today, every step was an announcement. The receptionist, a young woman with a sharp bob and a headset that looked like a piece of jewelry, looked up. In my old gray cardigan, she might not have seen me at all. But in the charcoal silk, she sat up straighter. "Good morning. I'm Martha Sterling," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was the voice I used when I was alone in the garden, speaking to the earth. "Welcome, Mrs. Sterling," she said, her eyes widening slightly as she checked her screen. "The board of directors and the representatives from Sterling Logistics are already in conference room A. Shall I escort you?" "No, thank you. I know the way," I said. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The ascent was silent, the kind of pressurized silence that makes your ears pop. I looked at my reflection in the mirrored walls. The pearls against my throat looked like small, frozen tears. I remembered the day David told me they were too much for a simple office party. I realize now he didn't want me to look like someone who owned something. He wanted me to look like someone who belonged to him. When the doors opened, the executive floor smelled of expensive ozone and filtered air. I walked toward the glass-walled conference room. Through the tint, I could see them. David was standing at the head of the long mahogany table, gesturing at a digital screen showing a series of aggressive growth charts. Julian sat to his right, nodding fervently at every word his father spoke. They looked like two men trying to sell a used car to a god. Opposite them sat the Vanguard board, 6 men and women in dark suits, their faces unreadable, their pens poised over legal pads. I stood outside the door for a moment, just watching. David looked older than he did at the breakfast table. There was a desperation in the set of his shoulders that he never showed me. At home, he was a giant. Here, he was a supplicant. The merger isn't just a benefit for Sterling, David was saying, his voice muffled by the glass. It's a necessity for Vanguard's regional expansion. We have the infrastructure. We have the legacy. And what about the overhead? Sarah Jenkins, my father's attorney, asked. She was the only one in the room who knew I was standing there. She didn't look at me, but her posture shifted. Your reports show a significant amount of capital tied up in personal assets and underperforming domestic structures. Julian chimed in, his voice cracking slightly. We're already addressing that. We're liquidating several high-value real estate holdings, including the primary family residence. It's about streamlining. We're moving the non-essential elements of the family structure into assisted environments to focus entirely on the firm. Non-essential elements. That was me. I was the line item they were deleting to make the numbers look better for the strangers in the room. I reached for the door handle. It was heavy, cold, and solid. I pushed it open. The sound of the door latch clicking was like a gunshot in the room. David didn't even turn around at first. "We're in a private session," he said, his voice sharp with the irritation he usually reserved for when I forgot to buy his specific brand of mineral water. "Wait at the reception desk." "I don't think I will, David," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a car crash, before the screaming starts. David turned slowly. His face went through a terrifying metamorphosis, from professional annoyance to confusion, then to a pale, sickly realization. He looked at my suit. He looked at my hair. He looked at the pearls. "Martha?" he whispered. His voice sounded small. Julian's mouth actually hung open. He looked at me as if I were a ghost that had just walked through a wall. "Mom? Why are you dressed like that? You're supposed to be meeting the plumber." "The plumber was canceled, Julian," I said. I walked to the empty chair at the head of the table, the chair reserved for the president of Vanguard. Sarah Jenkins stood up. "Members of the board, representatives of Sterling Logistics, I believe you haven't been formally introduced to our majority shareholder and the new president of the Vanguard Group." I sat down. The leather of the chair was cool and firm. I looked at David, who was still standing, his hand trembling slightly against the mahogany table he had spent 30 years trying to impress. "Sit down, David," I said softly. "You're hovering. It's bad for the family image." David sank into his chair as if his bones had turned to liquid. "Martha, I don't understand. Your father, the estate was supposed to be tied up in probate for years. The lawyers told you what I instructed them to tell you," I interrupted. I opened the leather folio Sarah had placed in front of me. "I needed to see how you would handle the burden of my existence once you thought I had nothing left to offer. I needed to see how quickly you would sell the roof over my head to save a company you've been mismanaging for a decade." "Mom, wait," Julian said, his voice rising in a panicked pitch. "We were doing it for you. The Willows is top tier. We just wanted you to be comfortable." I looked at my son. I looked at the man I had stayed up with through every fever, whose every failure I had smoothed over with my own labor. You wanted the equity, Julian. You wanted to move me into a room where you wouldn't have to look at the old sweater of my life anymore. You wanted me to be a ghost so you could play at being a king. I turned my gaze to the board. They were watching the three of us with a clinical, detached interest. To them, this was better than a movie. This was a hostile takeover from the inside out. The proposal for the merger is on the table, I said, my voice steady and cold. But before we discuss the financials, we need to discuss the personnel. I slid a document across the table toward David. It wasn't a merger agreement. It was an audit of the last 5 years of Sterling Logistics, specifically the discretionary spending David had used to fund his club memberships and Julian's failed tech startups. Your company is a hollow shell, David, I said. And as of 9:05 this morning, Vanguard has acquired the debt you used to leverage your expansion. I don't just own the company that wants to buy you. I own the bank that holds your notes. David looked at the paper, then back at me. His eyes were watering, but not with grief. It was the watery gaze of a man who realized he had spent 30 years kicking a dog that had finally turned into a wolf. "What do you want, Martha?" he asked, his voice a broken rasp. "I want what you've been giving me for 30 years, I said. I want your silence, and then I want your resignation. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9:20 a.m. I had been president for 15 minutes, and I had already dismantled the world they thought they ruled. "Julian," I said, turning to my son, "I'm sure Claire is waiting for an update. Why don't you call her? Tell her the house isn't going on the market, but tell her she might want to start looking for a smaller apartment for the two of you. Your salary was the first thing I cut this morning." Julian's face went white. He looked at David, then back at me. "You can't do this. You're my mother." "And you," I said, leaning forward, "were my son. But it seems we both stopped being those things a long time ago." I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest as I said it. It wasn't the victory I thought it would be. It felt like burying something that had been dead for a very long time. I stood up, closing my folio. "The board will take the next hour to review the termination packages. David, Julian, you have until noon to clear your desks. Security will escort you to the lobby." I walked toward the door, but I stopped at the threshold. I didn't turn around. "David?" "Yes," he said, his voice hopeful for a split second. "Don't forget to pick up your laundry from the hallway on your way out. I won't be washing it anymore." I walked out of the room, the click of my heels echoing in the hallway. I didn't feel powerful. I felt empty. But for the first time in my life, that emptiness felt like a clean, open room where I could finally breathe. I got back into the elevator. As it descended, I felt the familiar weight of the gray cardigan in my memory. I wondered if I would ever be warm again. When I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Claire. "Martha, honey, I hope you're looking at that brochure. Julian says the garden suites fill up fast. Don't be stubborn." I didn't reply. I blocked her number, then David's, then Julian's. I stepped out into the sunlight. The city was loud, chaotic, and indifferent. It was beautiful. But as I hailed a cab, a thought occurred to me, one that made my stomach turn. David was a desperate man, and desperate men didn't just walk away from empires. He knew where I lived, he knew my routines, and he still had the keys to the front door. I realized then that the boardroom wasn't the end. It was just the declaration of war. The house felt larger when I stepped back inside. It was a trick of the light, perhaps, or the way the silence didn't feel like a blanket anymore, but like a vacuum. I walked through the foyer, the charcoal silk of my suit rustling, a sharp, synthetic sound that didn't belong in a hallway that usually smelled of floor wax and lavender. I didn't take off the suit. I went straight to the kitchen. The pot roast from the night before was still sitting on the counter, the fat congealed into a pale, sickly layer of white. I looked at it for a long time. This was the fuel of our family. Slow-cooked labor that was consumed in 20 minutes and forgotten by dessert. I didn't put it in the refrigerator. I walked to the trash can and scraped the entire thing in. The heavy thud of the meat hitting the bottom of the bin felt like a punctuation mark. My phone, resting on the granite island, began to vibrate. It skittered across the stone like an insect. I didn't have to look to know it was David. Then Julian. Then Claire. Then the landline started ringing, a shrill, piercing sound that I had ignored for years because it was usually just telemarketers. Now, it was the sound of a burning empire trying to call the fire department. I walked to the wall and unplugged the cord. The silence returned, but it was bruised. There was a shadow at the front door. A key turned in the lock. The familiar jingle, the heavy click of the deadbolt. My heart didn't race. It stayed at that new, low, steady hum. Julian walked in. He didn't have his folio or his bravado anymore. His tie was loosened, and his hair, usually plastered into a perfect wave, was windblown. He looked like a boy who had been sent home from school for fighting. "Mom?" he called out. He didn't sound angry yet. He sounded lost. "Mom, are you here?" I walked to the entrance of the kitchen. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. I didn't offer him a drink. I didn't ask how his day was. "You shouldn't be here, Julian," I said. He stopped in the middle of the foyer. He looked at me, his eyes scanning the silk suit, the pearls, the way I was standing. The security guard wouldn't let me back into my office. They had boxes, Mom. They put my things in boxes. My degrees, my awards. They were sitting on the sidewalk like trash. "They aren't trash," I said evenly. "They're just no longer part of the Vanguard infrastructure. You can take them to your condo." Julian took a step toward me, his hands reaching out, palms up, the universal gesture of someone asking for a miracle. "Dad is losing it. He's at the club, drinking. He's talking about suing the estate, suing Vanguard, suing you. He says you've been planning this for years, that you've been a mole in our own home." "A mole implies I was hiding," I said. "I was right here, Julian. I was at every dinner. I was at every holiday. I was the one who listened to your father talk for 3 decades about how women didn't have the stomach for real business. I wasn't hiding. He just stopped looking." Julian's face hardened. The confusion was being replaced by the same petulant entitlement I had seen since he was 5 years old.
"This is a game to you, isn't it? Some kind of midlife crisis revenge? You're going to destroy everything Dad built because he forgot an anniversary or because I don't call enough? Do you have any idea what this does to Claire? We have a mortgage, Mom. We have a lifestyle." "I know exactly what you have, Julian. I've been the one balancing the books for the household accounts you and your father used as a personal ATM. You don't have a lifestyle. You have a mountain of debt held together by the illusion of your father's competence." I walked past him toward the front door. I reached out and took his keys from the console table where he had dropped them. "Hey!" he snapped, reaching for them. I pulled them back, dropping them into my jacket pocket. "This house is being transferred into a private trust under Vanguard. It is no longer a family asset. It is my residence. You don't have a key to your boss's house, Julian. And since you no longer work for me, you certainly don't have a key to mine." "You're kicking me out?"
He laughed, a high, strained sound. I'm your son. You can't just turn off being a mother like a faucet. You turned off being a son a long time ago, I said, my voice dropping an octave. You became a consumer. You consumed my time, my energy, and my silence. You treated this house like a hotel, and me like the maid you didn't have to pay. Well, the hotel is under new management. I opened the front door. The afternoon air was turning gray, a storm rolling in from the east. Go home, Julian. Check on Claire. I imagine she's realized by now that the credit cards I authorized are no longer active. Julian stared at me. For a second, I thought he might actually hit something. The wall, the door, me. His chest heaved. He looked like his father in that moment, a man who believed that when the world stopped saying yes to him, the world was broken. You're going to be so lonely, he spat. When Dad leaves you, and he will, he'll leave you with nothing. Don't come crying to us. Don't think you can just come back and be grandma when Claire and I have kids. You're dead to us. He turned and stormed out, his footsteps thudding down the porch steps. I watched him go. I waited until his car sped away, tires screeching against the asphalt. Then, I closed the door and locked it. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door. You're going to be so lonely. The words didn't hurt the way he wanted them to. I had been lonely in this house for 20 years. I had been lonely while sitting next to David at the theater. I had been lonely while cooking Thanksgiving dinner for 10 people who didn't know my middle name. Loneliness wasn't the threat he thought it was. It was my natural habitat. I walked back into the kitchen. I picked up my phone. I had 300 missed calls and a dozen voicemails. I deleted them all without listening. Then, I saw a notification I hadn't expected. An alert from the home security system. The guest house, the small cottage at the back of the property that we used for storage, had its door opened 4 minutes ago. I hadn't given Julian the key to the guest house, and David was at the club. I looked at the small monitor on the wall, switching the feed to the backyard camera. The rain was starting to fall, blurring the lens, but I could see a figure huddled under the eaves of the cottage. It was Claire. She wasn't wearing her designer coat. She was wearing a thin hoodie, and she was carrying a small, battered suitcase, the kind you take when you're leaving in a hurry. She wasn't trying to break in. She was hiding. I watched her through the screen. She looked small, shivering in the damp cold. This was the woman who had called me a burden only hours ago. I realized then that David and Julian weren't the only ones with secrets. In a family built on silence, everyone has a basement they don't want anyone to see. I picked up the heavy flashlight from the drawer. I didn't put on a coat. I walked out into the rain, the silk of my suit soaking through instantly, turning the charcoal to a heavy, suffocating black. The rain was not a gentle mist. It was a cold, driving force that turned the manicured lawn into a series of shallow, muddy pools. By the time I reached the guest house, the charcoal silk of my suit was plastered to my skin, heavy and restrictive. It felt like a second skin, one that was far less comfortable than the old gray cardigan I had left on the bed. I didn't knock. I still had the master key on the ring in my pocket, the one Julian hadn't managed to take because he never thought to look in the kitchen's junk drawer, where I kept the real power of the house. I turned the key and pushed the door open. The guest house smelled of cedar, old linens, and the sharp, chemical tang of Claire's expensive perfume. She was sitting on a crate of old holiday decorations, her knees pulled up to her chest. The suitcase, a battered leather thing I recognized as belonging to my mother-in-law, lay open on the floor. It wasn't filled with clothes. It was filled with papers. Folders, receipts, and what looked like ledger books from Sterling Logistics. Claire jumped when the door opened, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. Her hair, usually a structural marvel of blonde waves, was limp and frizzy from the humidity. Without the mask of her makeup, she looked younger, terrified, and remarkably fragile. "Martha," she breathed, her voice trembling. I thought you were Julian." "Julian is gone, Claire. I took his keys," I said, stepping inside and closing the door against the wind. I didn't move toward her. I stood in the center of the small room, the water dripping from my hem onto the dusty floorboards. "Why are you in the guest house? And why do you have my mother-in-law's suitcase?" Claire looked down at the open case. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the edge of a yellowed folder. "Julian he's not who you think he is, Martha. I know you think he's just a spoiled version of David, but it's worse. He's been desperate for months. He's been moving money, not just company money. He's been using your name." I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the rain. "What do you mean, using my name?" "He forged your signature on a series of personal guarantees," Claire whispered, finally looking up at me. "He told me it was the only way to keep the firm afloat until the Vanguard merger. He said you were half gone anyway, that you wouldn't notice a few papers in the middle of the grocery lists. He used your credit, Martha, your personal inheritance from your aunt. He's bled you dry on paper." I looked at the suitcase. For 30 years, I had been the silent observer. I had seen David's affairs, his small cruelties, his ego. But I had missed this. I had been so focused on David's neglect that I hadn't seen my own son's betrayal. I had seen him as a petulant child, not a predator. "And why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "You were the one telling me I was a burden this morning. You were the one pushing for the senior suites." Claire let out a jagged, bitter laugh. "Because if you go to the Willows, the house gets sold. If the house gets sold, the audit starts. Julian told me that if I didn't help him convince you to move, he'd make sure the irregularities looked like they were your fault. He said no one would believe a confused old woman over a rising executive. I was trying to protect myself, Martha. I didn't want to go to jail with him." She stood up, her legs shaky. "But when I heard what happened at the board meeting, I realized he's done. He's going to spiral. And when Julian spirals, he looks for someone to burn. I came here to get the proof. I've been hiding these files here for weeks, just in case." I walked over to the suitcase. I looked down at a document on top. It was a loan application for $400,000. The signature at the bottom was a perfect imitation of my own, the elegant looped M I had practiced in finishing school. Psychologically, I felt a strange shift. The betrayal didn't hurt. It clarified things. My son didn't just overlook me. He had weaponized my perceived invisibility. He had used the ghost of his mother as a shield for his crimes. "He thinks I'm a ghost," I said softly. "He thinks you're a victim," Claire corrected. "He still thinks he's the smartest person in the room." I reached down and closed the suitcase. I didn't look at Claire, but I could feel her eyes on me, desperate for a lifeline. She had spent years belittling me to keep her place at Julian's side. And now she was offering me his head on a silver platter to save her own skin. It was a transaction, and I was very good at transactions. "You're going to stay here tonight," I said. "The guest house is off the main security grid. I'll bring you some food and a dry blanket." "Why are you helping me?" Claire asked, her voice small. "I'm not helping you, Claire. I'm securing a witness," I replied. I picked up the suitcase. The weight of it was substantial, the physical manifestation of my son's greed. "And Claire?" "Yes?" "Tomorrow morning, you're going to give a statement to Sarah Jenkins. If you lie, or if you try to leave, I'll let the board know exactly how much you knew about these irregularities before today. Do you understand?" Claire nodded fervently, the predatory glint in her eyes replaced by a dull, flat obedience. I walked out of the guest house and back into the rain. The walk to the main house felt shorter this time. The anger was a fuel, burning through the exhaustion. I entered the kitchen through the mudroom, stripping off the ruined silk jacket. I stood in my blouse, the suitcase on the island in front of me. The house was dark now, save for the light over the stove. I opened the suitcase again and began to spread the papers out. I needed to see the full extent of the damage. I needed to know exactly how much my son thought I was worth. As I reached the bottom of the case, my hand brushed against something hard and cold. Tucked into the side pocket was a small, velvet jewelry box. I opened it. Inside was a ring, a heavy, emerald-cut diamond. It was my mother's engagement ring. The one I had told Julian was missing 3 years ago. The one I had cried over, thinking I had lost the last physical connection to the woman who raised me. He hadn't lost it. He had stolen it. I stared at the ring, the green gold light of the stove reflecting in the stone. The phone on the counter began to ring. I didn't have to look at the caller ID. I knew the rhythm of the ring. Long, insistent, aggressive. David. I picked it up this time. I didn't say hello. "Martha, you listen to me." David's voice was thick, the slur of the club's scotch apparent even through the static. "I'm at the house in 10 minutes. I don't care about the board. I don't care about the shares. That house is mine. You're going to open the door, and we're going to fix this. You've had your little moment, but the game is over." "The game isn't over, David," I said, my voice as cold as the rain outside. "It's just that the rules have changed, and you're not the one keeping score anymore." "I'm coming home, Martha," he roared. "I wouldn't do that," I said, "because if you step foot on this property, I'll tell the police about the suitcase Julian left in the guest house. I think you'll find the contents illuminating." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear David's ragged breathing. "What suitcase?" he whispered. "The one with your signature next to Julian's," I lied. I didn't know if David's signature was in there yet, but the silence told me everything I needed to know. He was complicit, or at the very least, he was terrified that he was. I hung up the phone. I sat down at the kitchen table, the stolen ring on my finger, and began to read. Outside, the storm intensified, the wind howling through the eaves of the house I had built with my silence. But inside, for the first time in 30 years, the silence was finally mine to break. I realized then that I wasn't just reviewing their department for layoffs. I was reviewing their lives for total liquidation. The headlights of David's sedan swept across the kitchen walls like searchlights, momentarily illuminating the stacks of fraudulent documents spread across the island. I didn't move. I sat in the darkness, lit only by the green glow of the stove's clock, and the faint, rhythmic pulse of the home security monitor. I heard the heavy thud of his car door, then the stumbling footsteps on the porch. The key fumbled in the lock, once, twice, before the door finally swung open. David didn't burst in with the roar he'd used on the phone. He entered quietly, the rain-drenched air following him like a shroud. He stood in the foyer, breathing heavily, his silhouette a ragged mess against the streetlights outside. He didn't see me at first. He walked toward the kitchen, likely heading for the liquor cabinet, his movements guided by 30 years of muscle memory. He reached for the light switch. The overhead LEDs hummed to life, and David recoiled, blinking like a subterranean creature suddenly exposed to the sun. "You're still in that suit," he said. His voice was thick, a mixture of scotch and exhaustion. He looked at me, then at the island. His eyes landed on the suitcase, then the papers, and finally, the emerald-cut diamond on my finger. He went very still. The aggression I had expected, the shouting, the demands, seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a hollow, vibrating fear. "Where did you get that?" he asked, pointing a trembling finger at the ring. "In the suitcase Julian was hiding," I said, "along with the proof that our son has been signing my name to high-interest loans for the last 18 months. He stole this from me, David. He let me believe I'd lost a piece of my mother's soul while he used it as collateral for his own failures." David walked to the island, leaning heavily on the granite. He looked at a signature on a loan document, my name written in Julian's practiced hand. He didn't look surprised. That was the most devastating part. He didn't look shocked. "He was trying to save the legacy, Martha," David whispered. "We were so close. If the Vanguard merger had gone through yesterday, the cash infusion would have covered these notes. No one would have known. You would have stayed in your garden, Julian would have been a hero, and Sterling would have survived." "At the cost of my life," I said. "You were going to put me in a facility, sell this house to cover the remaining debt, and let me live out my days in a luxury suite while you and Julian played at being successful on the back of my stolen inheritance." I stood up. I was taller than him in my heels, a physical reality that seemed to unsettle him. For decades, I had made myself small. I had sat while he stood. I had looked up when he spoke. I looked at the domestic expenses Julian flagged as redundant, David. "Do you know what they were?" David didn't answer. He reached for a bottle of bourbon on the counter, but I moved faster, sliding it out of his reach. "No," I said. "You've had enough liquid courage. Now you're going to listen." The redundant expenses included my health insurance, my quarterly specialist appointments for my heart murmur, the maintenance for the garden I love. Julian marked them all for liquidation in the final merger proposal. He wasn't just erasing my presence in this house, he was erasing my future. David sank into one of the bar stools. He looked older than 70. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "I didn't know about the insurance," he muttered. "I swear, Martha, I told him to make the numbers work." "That's your epitaph, David. I told someone else to make it work." You never looked at the cost of your comfort. You never looked at me. You looked through me, at the wall behind me, at the legacy you thought you were building. I leaned over the island, my face inches from his. But here is the psychological truth you're failing to grasp. A legacy built on a void eventually collapses into it. You didn't build a firm. You built a theater. And the audience has finally left. David looked at the emerald ring. A strange, bitter smile touched his lips. You think you've won? You're sitting in a house full of evidence of your son's crimes. If you use those papers to destroy Julian, you destroy yourself. The Sterling name will be dragged through every court in the state. Vanguard will be tainted by the association. You'll be the woman who sent her only child to prison. Is that what you think this is? I asked. A threat of prison? What else is it? It's a divorce, David. He laughed, a dry, hacking sound. At our age? After 35 years? You're going to file for divorce because Julian was a bad businessman? I'm filing for divorce because you were a silent partner in my erasure, I said. And because I don't need the Sterling name anymore. I have my own. I have my father's shares. And as of tomorrow morning, Vanguard is stripping Sterling Logistics of its assets and folding the remainder into a charitable trust. There will be no firm left to sue. There will be no legacy left to protect. David's smile vanished. You're liquidating everything? Martha, that's my life. Everything I worked for. No, I said, picking up the suitcase. It's everything I worked for. The late nights I spent proofreading your reports. The galas I hosted for people I loathed so you could secure contracts. The 30 years of silence I gave you so you could feel like the loudest man in the room. I'm just taking my back pay. I walked toward the foyer, the heavy leather of the suitcase bumping against my leg. Where are you going? David shouted, standing up so quickly his stool toppled over. To the guest house, I said. Claire is waiting for me. We have a lot of work to do before the sun comes up. Claire? David's voice hit a new note of panic. What does she have to do with this? I stopped at the edge of the kitchen. She's the one who gave me the suitcase, David. It turns out Julian isn't the only one who knows how to survive. He taught her well. She knows exactly how to identify a sinking ship. I walked out the front door and back into the night. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the air smelling of wet stone and pine. I didn't look back at the house. I knew David was standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the physical evidence of his obsolescence. I knew he was looking at the empty space where I used to be. The woman who provided the salt, the clean shirts, and the silence. But as I approached the guest house, a new thought chilled me. If Julian was desperate enough to steal my mother's ring and forge my signature, what would he do when he realized Claire had betrayed him? I looked at the small cottage. The lights were off. Too off. I had told Claire to keep the lamp on so I could find my way back in the dark. I dropped the suitcase and ran. My heels sank into the mud, slowing me down, but I reached the door and threw it open. The room was empty. The blankets I had brought her were folded neatly on the crate. The window at the back was standing wide open, the curtains fluttering in the damp breeze. On the small wooden table, where I had left a plate of crackers and cheese, was a single item. It was Julian's wedding ring, and beside it, scrawled in lipstick on a paper napkin, were 3 words. He found me. The curtains in the guest house whipped like frantic white wings in the draft. I stood over the small wooden table, staring at the words, "He found me," until they blurred into a red smear. The waxy scent of the lipstick, a shade Claire called power red, clung to the damp air. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for those who believe someone is coming to save them. I had spent 30 years realizing no one was coming. I picked up Julian's wedding ring. It was heavy, platinum, and cold. He had dropped it here as a a shedding of his last skin of domesticity. By leaving it, he wasn't just abandoning Claire. He was telling me that the person I thought I could negotiate with, the son I had raised, no longer existed. I walked to the open window. The grass outside was trampled, deep gouges in the mud leading toward the back gate that opened into the wooded ravine behind our property. Julian knew the sensors there were old. I'd been asking David to replace them for 3 years. David had always said we didn't need to worry because everyone knows who lives here. I closed the window and locked it. It was a futile gesture, like bandaging a ghost, but my hands needed the work. I walked back to the main house. The rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof. Inside, the kitchen was still bright, still smelling of the bourbon David had spilled. He was sitting on the floor now, his back against the refrigerator, staring at the toppled bar stool. "She's gone," I said. David looked up, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. "Who?" "Claire. Julian took her." I held out the napkin. David didn't reach for it. He recoiled as if the paper were a hot coal. No, he wouldn't. He's a good boy, Martha. He's under a lot of pressure. He probably just took her home to talk, to fix things." "He took her through a window, David. He left his wedding ring on a pile of evidence that could put him in prison. This isn't fixing things. This is a cornered animal trying to eliminate a witness." I walked to the sink and began to wash the bourbon-soaked floor with a rag. I needed the routine. I needed the physical act of cleaning up a mess that wasn't mine. "Call him," David pleaded. "Call him and tell him you'll drop the audit. Tell him we can go back to the way it was. We'll sell the house, I'll retire, we'll disappear." I stopped scrubbing and looked at him. Truly looked at him. "You still don't understand, do you? There is no way it was. The woman who would have dropped the audit died the moment I saw my mother's ring in that suitcase. The woman who would have saved you died when you suggested I was a burden for wearing an old sweater." "I was drunk! I was stressed!" David shouted, his voice cracking. "You were honest," I corrected. "Wine doesn't create feelings, David. It just stops you from hiding them." The house phone, the one I had plugged back in for the security system, began to ring. The sound was deafening in the hollow kitchen. David scrambled to his feet, his joints popping. He reached for the receiver, but I blocked his hand. I picked it up. "Martha?" the voice on the other end said. It wasn't Julian. It was Sarah Jenkins. "Sarah, it's late." "I just got a notification from the Vanguard security team," Sarah said, her voice tight with professional concern. "Someone tried to access the corporate server using your personal credentials 10 minutes ago, from a remote IP. They were looking for the redundant asset files you created this morning." I looked at the suitcase on the island. Julian didn't just want Claire. He wanted the list of people I was about to fire. He wanted to see who else was desperate. "Did the firewall hold?" I asked. "For now. But Martha, there's something else. I had my investigators look into the personal guarantees Julian forged. It's not just your name. He's been using David's private accounts as collateral for a series of offshore investments that went bust in the spring. If Vanguard doesn't absorb the debt, David is looking at total personal bankruptcy. They'll take the house, they'll take his pension, everything." I looked at David. He was watching me with the pathetic, wide-eyed hope of a dog waiting for a scrap. He didn't know yet that the bowl was empty. "Thank you, Sarah. Keep the server locked down. I'll handle the family side." I hung up. "What did she say?" David asked, stepping closer. "Is Julian okay? Is he coming back?" "Julian has been stealing from you too, David," I said. "Not just the company. Your private accounts. Your retirement. It's all gone." David's face didn't change at first. The information seemed to bounce off the shield of his denial. Then, slowly, his mouth began to twitch. He reached for the counter to steady himself. "What? No. He has power of attorney, but only for emergencies. He wouldn't. He knows that's our safety net." "He saw you as a safety net, David. And he fell. Now he's pulling you down with him." I felt a sudden, sharp pang of something I hadn't felt in years. Exhaustion. Not the emotional fatigue of being a wife, but a physical, bone-deep weariness. I walked to the table and sat down across from the stacks of paper. "He's at the lake house," David whispered. I looked up. "What?" "The cabin, in the Oakhaven tract," David said, his voice trembling. "It's the only place he has a key to that isn't tied to the firm's security. He used to go there when he was a kid to hide when he failed a test or got into trouble. He called it his fortress." "Is that where you'd go?" I asked. David nodded. "It's isolated, no cell service, just the woods and the water." I stood up and grabbed my car keys. "Where are you going?" David cried, stumbling after me into the foyer. "You can't go there alone. He's dangerous, Martha. He's not himself." "He's exactly himself, David. That's the problem," I said. I grabbed my trench coat, the heavy, dark one that didn't show the rain. "I'm going to get Claire, and I'm going to give Julian one chance to hand over the passwords to the offshore accounts before I call the authorities." "Let me come with you," David begged. He was clutching at my sleeve, his expensive silk shirt stained and wrinkled. He looked diminished, a shadow of the man who had commanded boardrooms. He was now entirely dependent on the woman he had tried to discard. "No," I said, peeling his fingers off my arm. "You stay here. You wait for the plumber. He's coming at 11, remember? You wouldn't want him to think the master of the house can't even handle a leaky faucet." I opened the door. The wind gusted in, cooling the heated air of the foyer. "Martha!" David called out as I stepped onto the porch. "Why are you doing this? After everything we said tonight, why save Claire? Why save my money?" I paused, looking back at him through the frame of the door. He looked like a small, lost child in a very large, very expensive suit. "I'm not saving your money, David," I said. "I'm securing the assets of the Vanguard Group. And as for Claire, she's the only person who knows where the bodies are buried. I'd hate for her to become one." I closed the door on his face. The drive to Oakhaven was 40 minutes of winding, blacktop roads and the hypnotic rhythm of the windshield wipers. The psychological weight of the situation sat in the passenger seat beside me. I realized that for 30 years, I had been the one to maintain the family peace. I was the glue, and now that the glue had dried and cracked, the pieces were sharp enough to draw blood. As I turned onto the gravel road that led to the lake house, I saw a flicker of light through the trees, a single amber glow. Julian's SUV was parked crookedly in the driveway, its lights off, its hood still clicking as the engine cooled. I parked 100 yards back, turning off my lights. I sat in the darkness for a moment, my hand resting on the steering wheel. I felt the emerald ring on my finger. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I wasn't a wife. I was a creditor. And I was here to collect. I stepped out of the car. The woods were loud with the sound of the storm, a cacophony of groaning branches and rushing water. I walked toward the cabin, my eyes fixed on that amber light. I didn't see the shadow move behind the shed until it was almost too late. The shadow didn't lunge. It didn't growl. It simply detached itself from the darkness of the tool shed and became my son. Julian was drenched, his expensive wool coat ruined, clinging to his frame like the skin of a drowned animal. He wasn't holding a weapon, but his hands were curled into tight, white-knuckled fists. In the dim amber light spilling from the cabin's porch, his eyes looked like two burnt-out holes in his head. "I knew you'd come," he said. His voice was a thin, reedy thing, stripped of the corporate baritone he used to command meetings. "Dad is a coward. He's probably still sitting in the kitchen waiting for the world to fix itself. But you always show up to clean the gutters." "I'm not here to clean, Julian," I said, my voice steady despite the frantic thudding in my chest. "I'm here for Claire, and I'm here for the passwords." Julian let out a jagged, wet laugh. He took a step toward me, and I didn't flinch. I felt the weight of the emerald ring on my finger, a cold anchor of reality. "The passwords," he repeated. "Always the assets. You spend 30 years playing the martyr, the perfect mother who never asks for a thing, and the moment you get a taste of power, you're just like the rest of us. You're just like Dad. You just hide it better under those old sweaters." "I am nothing like your father," I said. "And I am nothing like the version of me you've been using as a doormat. Where is Claire?" Julian gestured vaguely toward the cabin. "She's inside. She's fine. She's just processing. She's not as strong as you, Mom. She doesn't know how to turn into a stone when the wind starts blowing." I walked past him. I didn't wait for him to lead the way. I stepped onto the creaking porch of the lake house. This place smelled of decades of neglected summers, damp pine, mothballs, and the lingering scent of wood smoke from a chimney that hadn't been swept in years. Inside, the cabin was a graveyard of our family's happier lives. There were photos on the mantel of Julian as a boy, holding up a fish he hadn't caught. David standing behind him, with a hand on his shoulder, smiling for a camera I was holding. I was never in the photos. I was always the one documenting their lives, ensuring their memories looked the way they wanted them to. Claire was sitting in a moth-eaten armchair by the cold hearth. She wasn't bound, but she looked paralyzed. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, and she was wrapped in a dirty wool blanket that looked like it had been chewed by mice. She looked up when I entered, and the relief that flooded her face was so intense it looked like pain. "Martha," she whispered. "Get your things, Claire," I said. "She's not going anywhere," Julian said, stepping into the room behind me. He slammed the door, the sound echoing through the small space. He didn't lock it. He didn't have to. The isolation of the Oakhaven tract was its own lock. "Not until we talk about the redundant assets list. I saw what you were doing on the server, Mom. You're firing Miller? You're cutting the entire logistics fleet in the tri-state? That's my infrastructure." "It's a hemorrhage, Julian," I said, turning to face him. "The company was dying because you and David were treating it like a personal vault. I'm not firing Miller. I'm preventing a total collapse that would leave 300 families without pensions. I am doing the work you were too arrogant to do." Julian's face contorted. He looked less like a businessman and more like the toddler who used to throw his toys against the wall when he lost a game. "You don't know anything about the work. You stayed home. You made the pot roast. You didn't see the pressure, the way the market was squeezing us." "I saw everything," I interrupted, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "I saw the pressure because I was the one you took it out on. I was the one who listened to your father's rants for 3 hours every night so he wouldn't blow up at the board. I was the one who balanced the household accounts so you wouldn't notice you were over-leveraged. I was the silent partner in every success you ever had. And you rewarded me by stealing my mother's ring. I held up my hand, the diamond catching the low light. Julian's eyes fixed on the ring. The shame finally flickered there, a brief, weak flame before the entitlement snuffed it out. I was going to give it back. I just needed the bridge loan. I knew you'd never miss it. You never wear it anyway. I never wear it because I didn't want to explain to your father that it was the only thing I had that he didn't buy for me, I said. But that's over. The silence is over. Give me the passwords to the offshore accounts, Julian. Now. And if I don't? Then I walk out of here with Claire. And I call Sarah Jenkins. By the time you get back to the city, the SEC will be waiting at your condo. Your lifestyle will be a matter of public record. And Claire? Claire will be the state's star witness. Julian looked at Claire. She shivered under the blanket, but she didn't look away this time. She saw the shift in power. She saw that the burden was the only one in the room with the strength to end this. You wouldn't do that to me, Julian said, though the conviction was gone from his voice. I'm your son. You've spent 30 years protecting me. And that was my greatest failure, I said. I protected you from the consequences of being a Sterling. I made you think the world owed you a safety net. Well, I'm the net, Julian, and I'm folding up. Julian slumped against the door. He looked around the cabin, at the old photos, the dusty furniture, the ruins of his fortress. He realized he was trapped, not by me, but by the very dependency he had cultivated. He didn't know how to exist without a woman to clean up after him. The password is Bluebird1992, he whispered. The year you were born, I said. It was a final, pathetic attempt at emotional manipulation. I'll transfer the access codes to your phone, he said, his head hanging low. Just tell Dad I tried. Tell him I almost had it. Tell him yourself, I said. He's at the house. He's waiting for the plumber. I walked over to Claire and helped her stand. She was shaking, her skin cold to the touch. I guided her toward the door. Julian didn't move. He stayed slumped against the wall, a broken executive in a damp cabin. As we stepped out onto the porch, the rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, oppressive fog in its wake. The woods were silent now, the storm having spent its rage. Martha? Claire whispered as we reached my car. Yes? What happens to him now? I looked back at the amber light of the cabin. The same thing that happens to everything that outlives its purpose, Claire. It waits for the lights to go out. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. But as I pulled away, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A set of headlights, deep in the trees, turning on just as I moved. It wasn't David. David didn't know how to find the back entrance to Oak Haven. I realized then that the audit hadn't just alerted the board. It had alerted the people David and Julian owed money to, the ones who didn't care about family structures or redundant assets. I stepped on the gas, the tires spitting gravel. The psychological game was over, but the physical reality of their debts was just beginning to catch up. The headlights in the rearview mirror remained a constant, twin-eyed threat as I navigated the rain-slicked curves of the Oak Haven tract. They didn't flash their high beams. They didn't attempt to overtake. They simply mirrored my speed, a silent, predatory presence in the fog. Beside me, Claire was curled against the passenger door, her breath hitching every time the tires hit a patch of standing water. She was staring at the dashboard, her hands gripped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles looked like polished stones. "Who is that, Martha?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. "One of the ghosts David and Julian invited into our lives," I said. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the road, calculating the distance to the main highway. I knew these roads better than anyone. I was the one who had spent 30 years driving Julian to summer camps and David to the marina when he'd had too much to drink. I knew where the gravel thinned and where the shoulders dropped off into the dark. Are they going to stop us? They're waiting for us to lead them to the assets, Claire. They don't want us. They want what the Sterling name still represents. The psychological weight of the last 24 hours was starting to settle in my joints, a cold, heavy ache. I had spent my life thinking the greatest threat to my peace was the indifference of my family. I had been wrong. The greatest threat was the world they had built in the shadows of that indifference. While I was worrying about pot roasts and garden shears, they were playing with men who viewed people as collateral. I reached the highway and floored the accelerator. The car behind me matched the surge. When we finally pulled into our driveway 40 minutes later, the main house was ablaze with light. Every window was glowing, making the estate look like a ship lost at sea. David's sedan was still parked crookedly near the porch, but there was another vehicle now, a nondescript gray van parked near the service entrance. The plumber. I parked the car and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire didn't move. "Stay in the car, Claire. Lock the doors. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, drive to the police station in the village." "Martha, don't go in there," she pleaded, reaching for my arm. Her touch was frantic, the first time she had ever reached for me out of genuine need rather than a demand for service. "I have to see what your father-in-law has signed away while I was gone," I said, gently uncurling her fingers. I stepped out of the car. The air was still and heavy with the scent of wet pine. I walked up the porch steps, my heels clicking with a hollow, lonely rhythm. I didn't use my key. I pushed the door open. It wasn't locked. The foyer was impeccably clean, just as I had left it, but the atmosphere had changed. The house felt like it had been hollowed out, the soul of it replaced by something clinical and cold. I walked into the kitchen. David was sitting at the island. He wasn't crying anymore. He looked remarkably composed, almost tidy. Standing across from him, near the sink, was a man in a high-quality navy windbreaker. He was holding a tablet and a small electronic scanner. He wasn't looking at David. He was scanning the underside of the granite countertop. "David?" I said. My husband looked up. A small, pathetic smile touched his lips. The smile of a man who has finally been told what to do and is relieved by the lack of choice. "Martha, you're back," he said. "This is Mr. Vance. He's with the restructuring group. He said the private creditors needed a physical inventory of the primary residence before the trust takes over." Mr. Vance looked up. He had the face of an actuary, bland, efficient, and entirely devoid of empathy.
"Mrs. Sterling, I apologize for the late hour. We were told the house was being vacated immediately as part of the debt settlement."
"The debt settlement hasn't been finalized, Mr. Vance," I said, walking to the island and placing the suitcase from the lake house on the counter. "And this house is not a Sterling asset. It is held in a private trust by the Vanguard Group, of which I am the president. You are trespassing." Vance didn't look bothered. He tapped his tablet.
"I have a personal guarantee signed by David Sterling and Julian Sterling, using the equity of this property as secondary collateral for a high-interest bridge loan. The default occurred at midnight."
"My name is not on that guarantee," I said.
"We have a signature, Mrs. Sterling.
Vance said, his voice as smooth as oil.
A Martha Sterling, notarized.
I looked at David. He looked away, his eyes fixing on a spot on the wall. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian hadn't just forged my name on corporate documents. He had done it on the house. And David, my husband, the man who had slept beside me for 3 decades, had watched him do it. "Did you know, David?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper.
It was just a formality, Martha,
David said, his voice thin.
We were going to pay it back. It was the only way to get the cash for the offshore move. We thought we had more time.
I looked at the kitchen I had spent 30 years maintaining. I looked at the tiles I had scrubbed, the meals I had prepared, the space I had occupied as a ghost. It wasn't just a house. It was the physical record of my life's labor. And they had wagered it on a lie. I turned back to Mr. Vance. "The signature is a forgery. I have the proof in this suitcase. I have the witness, Claire Sterling, in the car. And I have the passwords to the accounts Julian used to hide the theft."
Vance paused, his stylus hovering over the screen.
For the first time, a flicker of something like interest appeared in his eyes.
The offshore accounts? The ones in the Cayman Vanguard loop?
Exactly those, I said. And if you want access to them, if you want to see a single cent of the money Julian stole, you will leave this house immediately. You will take your restructuring, and you will wait for a call from Sarah Jenkins. Vance looked at the suitcase, then at me. He was a shark, and he recognized a bigger predator when he saw one. He knew David was a dry well. He saw that I was the reservoir. "You have until 9 a.m. to produce the codes, Mrs. Sterling," Vance said. He tucked the tablet under his arm and walked toward the door. He didn't look at David. He didn't look at the house. To him, we were just numbers moving from one column to another. When the front door closed, the silence in the kitchen became suffocating. David stayed seated at the island. He looked small, a withered husk of a man in an expensive chair.
"Martha,"
he started, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I didn't think—" "You never did," I interrupted. I walked to the sink and turned on the faucet. I began to wash the single glass David had used for his water. "You didn't think I was a person. You thought I was a feature of the landscape. You thought the house belonged to you because you paid the mortgage, never realizing that I was the one who made it worth living in."
"What are we going to do?"
he asked. "Vance, those people, they aren't like the board. They don't care about lawsuits." "There is no we, David," I said, drying the glass and placing it perfectly in the cupboard. "I am going to save this house. I am going to save Claire. And I am going to ensure that Vanguard absorbs the assets of your failed life."
"And me?"
I looked at him. I looked at the man I had given my youth, my silence, and my strength. "You're going to pack a bag, David. A small one.
Just the essentials."
"Where am I going?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brochure Julian had given me that morning. I slid it across the granite toward him. The woman on the cover was still laughing over her bridge game. "The Willows has a vacancy," I said. "Since you were so concerned about someone being a burden in an old sweater, I think you'll find the environment very appropriate." David stared at the brochure. His hands began to shake. "You're sending me to a nursing home? Martha, I'm 70. I'm not ready for that." "Neither was I, David. But you were perfectly happy to send me there when you thought it would save your skin. Now it's the only way I can keep you safe from the people you owe money to. It's strategic, remember?" I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him there with the glossy brochure and the ruins of his ego. I went to the front door and waved for Claire to come inside. As she crossed the threshold, she looked at me with a mixture of awe and terror. "Is it over?" she asked. "No," I said, looking up the grand staircase. "It's just the first time the house is finally quiet." But as I reached for the light switch, I saw a single red light blinking on the security panel. A new alert. Someone was at the back gate. Not a car. A person. I looked at the monitor. It was Julian. He wasn't at the lake house anymore. He was standing in the rain, staring directly into the camera lens. He was holding a gas can. My son, the redundant asset, had decided that if he couldn't have the empire, no one would. The red light on the security panel pulsed like a slow, bleeding heartbeat. On the grainy black and white monitor, Julian looked less like my son and more like a smudge of charcoal against the silver rain. He stood perfectly still at the back gate, the heavy plastic gas can dangling from his hand like a grotesque pendulum. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting to be seen. I didn't scream. I didn't rush to the phone. I felt a strange, clinical detachment, the kind an architect feels when looking at a blueprint of a building scheduled for demolition. "Claire," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the foyer. "Go into the pantry. There's a floor safe under the shelving. Lock yourself in and don't come out until I say your full name. Not Claire, not Honey. My full name." Claire looked at the monitor, her face draining of what little color it had left. "Martha, he's going to do it. He's lost his mind. We have to call the police." "The police are 10 minutes away, Claire. This house is made of old oak and silk wallpaper. 10 minutes is an eternity in a fire," I said. "Go. Now." She didn't argue. She fled toward the kitchen, her footsteps a frantic staccato. I turned to the kitchen island, where David was still staring at the brochure for the Willows. He hadn't even looked at the monitor. He was mesmerized by the image of his own obsolescence. "David," I said, "your son is at the back gate with an accelerant. He's going to burn the legacy you spent 30 years building." David finally looked up. His eyes were hollow, the light behind them extinguished. "He wouldn't. He loves this house. He used to play under the willow tree. He used to help me wash the cars in the driveway." "He loves the power the house represents, David. And since he no longer has the power, he's decided the house shouldn't exist. It's the ultimate temper tantrum of a man who was never told no." I walked to the mudroom, grabbing the heavy, oversized umbrella and the master remote for the external floodlights. I didn't feel fear. I felt a profound sense of closure. For years, I had been terrified of the family falling apart. Now that it had, I realized the pieces were much easier to manage than the whole. I stepped out onto the back porch. The air was thick with the smell of rain and the faint chemical sharpness of gasoline. I clicked the remote. 6,000 lumens of white light erupted, washing over the backyard. The manicured hedges, the stone fountain, and the rose bushes I had tended with my own bleeding fingers were suddenly as bright as a surgical theater. Julian winced, raising a hand to shield his eyes. He looked pathetic in the glare, a middle-aged boy caught with a match. "That's far enough, Julian," I said into the darkness, my voice amplified by the porch's intercom system. He dropped his hand and stared at the house. He couldn't see me through the glare of the floods, but he knew exactly where I was. He unscrewed the cap of the gas can, the plastic clicking in the silence. "You think you can just take it all?" Julian shouted,
his voice cracking and echoing off the stone walls. "You think you can just turn me into a redundant asset and go back to your quiet little life? I am this family, Mom. I am the one who carried the weight while you sat in the kitchen and faded into the paint." "You didn't carry anything, Julian," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. "You were carried. You were carried by my silence, by my labor, and by the lies your father told you about your own brilliance. You are not the family. You are the consequence of our worst choices." Julian began to tip the can. A dark, shimmering stream of gasoline splashed onto the dry wood of the back gate, the liquid smelling like an ending. "I'll burn it to the ground," he screamed. "I'll burn the records, the furniture, the photos. I'll leave you with nothing but the dirt." "Do it," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to pause. "What?" Julian stammered. "Burn it," I repeated. I stepped out from behind the porch pillar, letting the light catch the charcoal silk of my suit. "Burn the mahogany table where you sat and ignored me for 20 years. Burn the bed where I lay awake, wondering if you'd ever grow into a man of character. Burn the walls that absorbed the sound of your father's affairs and my own quiet weeping." "You think you're destroying my world, Julian? You're destroying my prison." Julian froze. The gas can was still tilted, the last few drops dripping onto his own shoes. He looked at the house, then back at the void where my voice was coming from. He had expected a mother's plea. He had expected me to beg for the memories. He didn't know how to deal with a woman who had already moved out of her own heart. "You're bluffing," he whispered. "I have the offshore passwords, Julian. I have the Vanguard board's loyalty. I have the deed to this property in a trust you can't touch. If you burn this house, I'll simply use the insurance money to build a library in my father's name. Your name won't even be on the dedication plaque. You'll be a headline in the local paper, 'Disgraced executive arrested for arson.' And then you'll be nothing." I walked down the porch steps, the wet grass soaking my silk trousers. I didn't stop until I was 10 feet away from him. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming now, a dizzying, toxic cloud. "Give me the can, Julian." "Stay back," he warned, fumbling in his pocket for a lighter. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the can. "I'll do it, Mom. I swear to God." "I know you will," I said, "because you're desperate to be the center of attention one last time. But look at you. You're standing in the rain, covered in fuel, threatening a woman who has already survived everything you could possibly do to her. What's the endgame? You light that match, and you go to prison for 20 years. No suits, no boardrooms, no Claire. Just the silence you've spent your life avoiding." Julian looked down at his hands. He found the lighter, a gold Zippo David had given him for his MBA graduation. He flicked it. The small orange flame danced in the damp air, a tiny, fragile defiance. "I hate you," he whispered, tears finally carving tracks through the grime on his face. "I know," I said softly. "It's the only way you can justify what you've become. It's easier to hate me than to admit you're a failure." I reached out my hand. For a long, terrifying second, I saw the muscles in his thumb twitch. I saw the impulse to drop the flame, to let the world turn into fire. I saw the 30 years of my own motherhood flash before me, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories, the pride I had tried so hard to feel for a man who was always hollow. Then, the flame went out. Julian let out a broken, shuddering sob and dropped the gas can. It hit the mud with a dull thud.
He collapsed to his knees, his forehead touching the wet wood of the gate he had just tried to ignite. He looked like a heap of discarded laundry. I didn't hug him. I didn't tell him it would be okay. I reached down, picked up the Zippo, and tucked it into my pocket. "The police will be here in 5 minutes, Julian," I said. "I called them the moment I saw you on the monitor." He looked up, his eyes wide with a new kind of betrayal. "You called them? You said you weren't going to." "I never said that," I replied. "I said I wouldn't beg. There's a difference." I turned my back on him and walked toward the house. My heart was a cold, hard stone in my chest. I felt the psychological weight of the final cord snapping. I had been a mother until the flame went out. Now, I was just the president of Vanguard, protecting her assets. As I climbed the porch steps, the first blue and red lights began to flicker through the trees at the end of the long driveway. The sirens were a low, mournful wail, coming to collect the remains of the Sterling legacy. I walked into the kitchen. David was still in the same spot, but he had opened the brochure. He was looking at a floor plan for a one-bedroom suite. Is he okay?" David asked, without looking up. "He's exactly where you put him, David," I said. I walked to the pantry and knocked 3 times. "Claire Sterling, it's Martha Sterling. You can come out now." The door opened and Claire stepped out, her eyes darting to the window where the police lights were now blindingly bright. "Is it over?" she asked. "For tonight," I said. I walked to the sink and began to wash my hands, scrubbing away the phantom scent of gasoline. But tomorrow, the audit starts in earnest, and I think we're going to find that the fire Julian started is a lot bigger than a back gate. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I looked tired. I looked older. But for the first time in my life, I didn't look like a ghost. I looked like the person who was going to decide who stayed and who went. The flashing lights of the police cruisers turned the rain into a rhythmic pulse of neon red and cold blue, a strobe effect that made the world feel disjointed and unreal. I stood on the porch, the charcoal silk of my suit now ruined, heavy with the weight of the night. I watched as the officers led Julian away. He didn't fight. He walked with his head down, his shoulders slumped in a posture of profound defeat. For 30 years, I had watched that boy, and then that man, move through life with an unearned grace, the kind only afforded to those who believe someone will always be there to catch them. As the cruiser door shut with a heavy, final thud, I realized I had finally stopped reaching out my arms. David stood behind me in the foyer, his breath hitching in a way that signaled a looming collapse. He wasn't looking at his son. He was looking at the neighbor's windows, where curtains were twitching. His primary concern, even as his only child was being taken away in handcuffs, was the social geography of the neighborhood. "We have to call Arthur," David whispered, referring to our family lawyer, a man who had spent 3 decades helping David bury his smaller indiscretions. "He can fix the optics. We can say it was a mental health crisis, a reaction to the stress of the merger." "Arthur works for Sterling Logistics, David," I said, not turning around. "And as of this morning, Sterling Logistics is a subsidiary of Vanguard. Arthur works for me now, and I have instructed him to cooperate fully with the district attorney." David grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. "You're going to let them prosecute him? Your own son? Martha, think about the name. Think about what this does to us." "There is no us, David. There is a woman who is tired of being a ghost, and there is a man who is about to learn how much a name is worth when the bank account is empty." I brushed his hand off my shoulder. The touch felt like a dead thing. I walked past him, heading for the stairs. I needed 4 hours of sleep before the sun came up. I had a board meeting at 8 a.m., not as a wife, not as a witness, but as the woman holding the gavel. The next morning, the air was crisp and clear, the storm having scrubbed the sky into a brilliant, mocking blue. I dressed with a precision that felt like ritual. I chose a structured navy blazer and a pair of trousers that had belonged to a version of me I'd buried years ago. I didn't look like a mother. I looked like an architect. I drove myself to the Sterling Logistics headquarters, a glass and steel monolith downtown that David always called his temple. As I walked through the lobby, the security guard, a man named Mike who had seen me bring David's forgotten lunches for 15 years, gave me a polite, pitying nod. "Morning, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice hushed. "Terrible business in the news this morning. Is Mr. Sterling coming in?" "No, Mike. Mr. Sterling is indisposed," I said. "I'll be using the executive elevator." He hesitated, his hand hovering over the keycard. He saw my second-hand coat, the one Claire had mocked, and for a second, I saw the internal calculation. To him, I was the burden wife, the one who usually waited in the lobby for 20 minutes because David was too busy to tell security I was coming. "I'm not sure I'm authorized." "I'm the president of Vanguard, Mike. Look at your memo from 6 minutes ago." He looked at his screen, and his eyes nearly doubled in size. He swiped the card so fast it clicked against the reader. "Of course, ma'am. Right this way." The elevator ride was silent. When the doors opened on the top floor, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of panic. Groups of executives were huddled in the hallways, their voices low and frantic. These were the men who had sat at my dinner table and talked over me as if I were a piece of the mahogany furniture. These were the men who had laughed when Julian made jokes about my quaint hobbies. I walked toward the main conference room. Miller, the vice president of operations, a man who once asked me to fetch him a gin and tonic during my own anniversary party, stepped out to intercept me. "Martha, what are you doing here?" he asked, his tone dripping with a condescending concern. "This is a restricted area. We're in the middle of a crisis. If you're looking for David, he's not here." "I know he's not here, Miller," I said, not slowing my pace. "I sent him to pack." "Pack?" "Martha, listen to me. I know you're upset about Julian, but you can't just wander in here. This is a business environment. Why don't you go down to the cafe? I'll have someone bring you a tea while we handle the adults' work." I stopped. I turned to look at Miller. I let the silence stretch between us until his smug smile began to falter. "The adults' work," I repeated softly. "Is that what you call the systematic embezzlement Julian was conducting under your nose? Or the $3 million in consulting fees you've been paying to your brother-in-law's shell company?" Miller's face went a sickly shade of gray. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You will by 10 o'clock, I said. I pushed open the double doors of the boardroom. The room went silent. Every seat was filled with the leadership of Sterling Logistics. They looked at me, at my sensible shoes, my lack of jewelry, the gray hair I had stopped dyeing 6 months ago. To them, I was a mistake, an intruder. I walked to the head of the table. I didn't sit. I placed my leather folio on the polished wood. "Good morning," I said. "My name is Martha Sterling. I am the president of the Vanguard Group. As of midnight, Vanguard has assumed total control of all Sterling Logistics assets and liabilities. This meeting is to discuss the immediate restructuring of your departments." A young man at the end of the table, one of Julian's protégés, let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh.
Is this a joke? Where's David? Where's Julian? We don't take orders from the catering staff, Martha.
I didn't blink. I opened my folio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Mr. Henderson, is it? You're the junior director of regional sales. Your department has shown a 40% decrease in efficiency, while your personal expense account has increased by 60%, mostly at a club called the Gilded Lily. The laughter died in his throat. You are the first redundant asset on my list, I said. You have 10 minutes to clear your desk. Security is waiting outside the door. I looked around the room. For the first time in 30 years, I was the only person speaking. I saw the realization dawn on them. The slow, creeping horror that the woman they had ignored, the woman who had absorbed their emotional damage and cleaned up their messes, was now the one holding their livelihoods in her hands. Now, I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning, let's talk about the rest of you. Psychologically, the room had shifted. They were no longer the predators, they were the prey, and I was the one deciding who was worth saving. But as the meeting progressed, I felt a vibration in my pocket. My phone, a text from an unknown number. I have the other suitcase, Martha, the one David forgot about in 1998. Meet me at the fountain in 20 minutes, or the Vanguard merger becomes a federal investigation. The handwriting in the attached photo wasn't Julian's. It wasn't David's. It was my father's. I looked at the men in the room, the ones I was about to fire. I realized that the silence I had kept for 30 years wasn't just my prison. It was a vault, and someone had finally found the combination. The boardroom was a tomb of expensive air and shattered egos. Miller stood by the mahogany table, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. He looked at the other executives, seeking a glance of solidarity, a spark of the old boys' club rebellion that had sustained them for decades. But the men around him were looking at their shoes, or their tablets, or the dust motes dancing in the light. They were calculating their own survival, and in that equation, Miller had already become a zero. You can't do this, Martha, Miller finally whispered, his voice cracking. I've been David's right hand for 30 years. I know where every contract is signed. I know the clients. Without me, this transition will be a bloodbath. The blood is already on the floor, Miller, I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. You weren't David's right hand. You were the hand he used to hide his own decay. You didn't manage the clients. You managed their expectations of a competence that didn't exist. Security will meet you at your office. Don't take anything that belongs to the firm. That includes the stationery. I didn't watch him leave. I didn't need to. I heard the heavy click of the double doors closing behind him, a sound that felt like a weight being lifted from the building itself. The rest of you, I said, turning my gaze back to the remaining board members. You have until the end of the day to submit a full disclosure of any discretionary bonuses received in the last fiscal year. If the numbers match our audit, you may keep your positions on a probationary basis. If they don't, you'll be joining Mr. Henderson in the unemployment line. I picked up my folio and walked out. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected. I just felt a heavy, dull ache in my lower back and a longing for a cup of tea in a kitchen that didn't smell like gasoline. I took the elevator down to the lobby. The text message was still glowing on my phone screen. Meet me at the fountain. The fountain was a modern sculpture of granite and cascading water in the center of the plaza, a gift from my father to the city in the late 90s. It was meant to symbolize constant progress. Now it just looked like a lot of noise over the same stone. Standing by the edge of the water was a woman who looked like she was made of iron and fine lace. She was wearing a coat that had been out of fashion for 20 years, but was maintained with a ferocity that made it look timeless. Evelyn. She had been my father's personal secretary for 40 years. When he died,
David had retired her within a week, giving her a gold watch and a pension that barely covered the property taxes on her cottage. I hadn't seen her in 5 years. "Martha," she said. Her voice was like parchment, dry, thin, but capable of holding a lot of weight. "Evelyn, you're the last person I expected to hear from today." She looked at the glass tower behind me. "I watched the news this morning. I saw the boy in handcuffs. I saw the fire. I knew it was time. David was always a small man in a large suit, but I didn't think he'd let the boy burn the house down." "He didn't have much of a choice," I said. "Where is the suitcase, Evelyn? And why did you wait until now?" She reached down into a rolling shopping bag at her feet and pulled out a small, battered leather attaché case. It was my father's, the one he used for his private correspondence, the one David told me had been lost in the move to the new headquarters in '98. "I waited because your father told me to," Evelyn said. She handed me the case. It was surprisingly heavy. He knew David. He knew that David's ambition was a fire that would eventually run out of fuel. He told me, "Evelyn, when the house is quiet and the fire is out, give this to Martha. She'll be the only one left who knows what to do with it." I took the case. The leather was cold and smelled of cedar and old ink. "What's in here?" "The truth about 1998, Evelyn said. "David didn't build Sterling Logistics on a loan, Martha. He built it on a theft. He stole the intellectual property for the routing software from your father's research division. And when your father found out, David didn't apologize. He threatened to use the irregularities in your father's estate to ruin your inheritance if he went to the authorities." I felt the world tilt slightly. My father knew? He knew David was blackmailing him? "Your father allowed it because he wanted you to have a family," Evelyn said, her eyes softening with a pity that stung more than Julian's hatred. "He thought if David had the company, he would be a better husband. He thought he could buy your happiness by giving David a kingdom. He didn't realize David would turn that kingdom into a cage for you." I gripped the handle of the suitcase. All those years I had spent thinking I was the one protecting the family, the one holding the glue together. I hadn't been the protector. I had been the collateral. My father had traded his life's work for a peace that never arrived. "There's more," Evelyn said. "In the bottom of that case there is a letter. It's addressed to the SEC. It was signed in 1998 but never filed. It details the exact mechanism of the theft. It's the one thing that can strip David of every legal defense he has left. It doesn't just take his money, Martha. It takes his history." I looked at the woman who had kept this secret for a quarter of a century. She had lived in that small cottage, watching the man who fired her grow rich on a lie, all because of a dead man's request. "Thank you, Evelyn," I said. "Don't thank me," she replied, turning to walk away. "Just finish it. I'm tired of watching that tower. I'd like to see it under new management before I go." I watched her disappear into the crowd. I stood by the fountain, the spray of the water cold against my face. I opened the case. On top of a stack of yellowed ledgers and technical diagrams was a single cream-colored envelope. My father's handwriting was on the front, bold and steady. "For Martha, when the silence is too loud." I opened the letter. But it wasn't a legal document. It was a single sheet of paper with a list of dates. July 14th, 1998. August 2nd, 2004. November 12th, 2012. Beside each date was a dollar amount and a name. The names were unfamiliar, but the dates, those were the dates of our family vacations.
The trip to Paris, the summer in the Hamptons, the cruise for our 25th anniversary. David hadn't just stolen the company, he had been using the stolen funds to pay off a series of private investigators. I scanned the final page. My breath caught in my throat. The investigators weren't following David's mistresses. They weren't looking for Julian's debts. They had been following me. Every time I went to the grocery store, every time I visited my father's grave, every time I sat in the park and read a book in the silence I thought was my own, David had been watching. He didn't view me as a ghost. He viewed me as a prisoner who didn't know she was in a cell. And the last entry on the list was dated yesterday. I looked up at the glass tower. My reflection was distorted in the windows, a small, dark shape against a mountain of light. I realized then that David didn't go to the Willows because I sent him there. He went there because he knew I had finally found the key to the door he'd been guarding for 30 years. I pulled out my phone and dialed the security desk at the Willows. "This is Martha Sterling," I said, my voice shaking with a rage I had never allowed myself to feel. "I need to check the guest log for room 402. Did David Sterling have any visitors this morning?" "One moment, Mrs. Sterling," the voice said. "Yes, Mr. Miller checked in to see him at 10:15 a.m. They're in the sunroom now." Miller. The man I had just fired. I hung up. They weren't packing. They were conspiring. I looked at the suitcase. My father hadn't given me a weapon to destroy David. He had given me the proof that David had never stopped trying to destroy me. I walked toward my car. I didn't feel tired anymore. I felt a cold, electric clarity. The game wasn't over. David was still trying to move the pieces from a nursing home. But he had forgotten one thing. I was the one who knew the layout of the house. And I was the only one who knew where the real emergency exit was. The drive to the Willows felt like a descent into a world made of beige linen and soft-lit lies. Every mile marker on the highway was a reminder of how much of my life I had spent in transit, moving between the demands of my husband and the needs of my son, never realizing I was being tracked like a migratory bird. I kept my father's attaché case on the passenger seat. My hand rested on the cool, cracked leather. Inside were the records of 30 years of surveillance. I thought back to those days. The afternoons I spent in the park, the mornings I spent at the library, those rare moments when I felt the heavy blanket of the Sterling name had finally slipped off my shoulders. I had felt free. But I hadn't been. I had been a specimen in a jar, and David had been the one holding the magnifying glass. He hadn't watched me because he was jealous. He didn't love me enough for jealousy. He had watched me because I was the only person who could testify to the vacuum at the center of his life. He needed to make sure I never found the exit. I pulled into the circular driveway of the Willows. It was a masterpiece of architectural condescension. Low-slung buildings with wide hallways and no sharp corners, designed for people the world no longer wanted to see. The gardens were perfect, but they were silent. No one was actually allowed to dig in the dirt here. The receptionist, a young woman with a smile so practiced it looked painful, looked up as I approached. "Mrs. Sterling, back so soon? Your husband is in the solarium. He and his associate are having a very productive morning." "I'm sure they are," I said. I walked down the hallway, my heels muffled by the thick, hospital-grade carpeting. The air smelled of lavender and industrial-strength disinfectant, I passed a group of residents in the common room, their eyes fixed on a television playing a silent news feed. They looked like they were waiting for something that was never going to happen. I found them in the corner of the solarium, a glass-walled room filled with ferns and the aggressive chirping of a caged canary. David was sitting in a high-backed wicker chair, a cashmere throw over his lap. Miller was leaning over a tablet, his face flushed with the kind of frantic energy that precedes a heart attack. They didn't hear me enter. The canary was too loud.
If we can move the holding company to the Dover Trust before the Vanguard audit hits the subledger, we can protect the remaining equity, Miller was saying, his voice a sharp hiss. But we need Martha's digital signature for the authorization. If she's blocked your access, we're dead in the water, David. She hasn't blocked the legacy accounts yet, David said. His voice sounded different, thinner but sharper. She thinks she's won. She's too busy playing president to look at the foundations. Martha always was a detail person, but she misses the big picture. She'll focus on Julian, and while she's distracted, we'll move the floor out from under her. I stood behind a large potted palm, watching them. This was the man I had nursed through bouts of pneumonia. This was the man whose hand I had held when his mother died. He was sitting in a nursing home, wearing a sweater I had bought him, plotting to steal the last of my father's ghost. "The big picture, David?" I asked, stepping into the light. Miller jumped so violently he nearly knocked the tablet off the table. David didn't jump. He slowly turned his head, a thin, patronizing smile spreading across his lips. "Martha, you really should call ahead. This is a private residence now." "It's a suite, David, and I'm the one paying the monthly invoice," I said. I walked to the table and set the attaché case down between them. The sound of the leather hitting the glass was like a gavel. Miller tried to stand, his face a mottled purple. "Martha, this is a legal consultation. You have no right—" "Sit down, Miller," I said, not looking at him. I kept my eyes on David. "The security guard at the front desk was very impressed by your associate. He didn't realize he was letting in a man I fired 3 hours ago for gross negligence and embezzlement." "I'm here as a friend," Miller spat. "You're here as a scavenger," I replied, "and you're about to be a defendant." I opened the attaché case. I pulled out the P.I. reports first. I fanned them out across the table like a deck of cards. Photos of me at the grocery store. Photos of me at my father's grave. Photos of me sitting in the garden, looking at the sky. David's smile didn't waver. "It was for your protection, Martha. You've always been fragile. The world is a dangerous place for a woman with your resources and your temperament." "My temperament?" I laughed, a short, cold sound that made the canaries stop chirping. "You mean the fact that I was the only person who knew you didn't have a single original thought in your head? You didn't watch me to protect me, David. You watched me to make sure I didn't realize I didn't need you." I pulled out the cream-colored envelope, the letter to the SEC from 1998. "This is from my father," I said. "It details the theft of the routing software. It describes exactly how you used his research division to build Sterling Logistics and how you blackmailed him into silence. It's signed David. It's notarized. And it's been waiting for me for 25 years." The color finally drained from David's face. He looked at the letter, then at Miller. The big picture was suddenly very small, and they were both trapped inside it. "He wouldn't have kept that," David whispered. "We had an agreement." "He kept it because he knew that a man who steals a kingdom will eventually try to burn it," I said. "And he wanted to make sure I had the water." I leaned over the table, my shadow falling over both of them. "Miller, you are going to leave this room. You are going to walk to your car, and you are going to drive to the nearest precinct and tell them everything you know about Julian's offshore moves. If you do that,
I might not include your brother-in-law's shell company in the Vanguard lawsuit.
Miller didn't hesitate. He grabbed his tablet and practically ran from the solarium, his footsteps frantic on the tile.
He didn't even look back at the man he had called his friend for 30 years. I was alone with David. The solarium felt very cold despite the morning sun. "You're going to destroy me," David said. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. "I'm not doing anything, David," I said. "I'm just letting the truth occupy the space I used to fill. You spent 30 years making me a ghost. Well, ghosts don't have to keep secrets anymore." David reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the cashmere throw on his lap. "What about the house, Martha? What about the family? If you file that letter, there is no Sterling. There is no legacy for Julian to come home to." "Julian is coming home to a prison cell, David. And the house? The house is finally going to be a home. Just not yours." I started to pack the papers back into the case. I felt a strange, hollow peace. The rage was gone, replaced by a profound, clinical clarity. "Wait," David said. He looked up at me, and for a split second, I saw the man I had married, the ambitious, charming man who had promised me the world. "There's one thing in those reports you didn't read, Martha. The one from 2012, November 12th. I paused. I remembered the date. It was the day I had spent 4 hours in the city, supposedly visiting a museum. "What about it?" "I didn't just have you followed to see where you went," David said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I had you followed to see who you met. On November 12th, you went to a law firm in the Heights, a divorce specialist. You sat in that office for 3 hours, Martha. And then you walked out and came home and made me dinner." I froze. He was right. I had gone there. I had sat in that cold leather chair and listened to a man tell me how much of my life I could legally reclaim. And then I had looked at the photos of Julian on the desk, and I had thought about the family, and I had walked out. "I knew you were thinking about leaving me for 10 years, David said. "And every day for those 10 years, I waited for you to do it. But you stayed. You stayed and you faded, and you let me take everything. Why, Martha? Why did you wait until I was in a nursing home to finally find your pulse?" I looked at him. This broken, manipulative man who had been waiting for me to leave so he didn't have to be the villain of the story. "Because I wanted to make sure that when I left," I said, "there was absolutely nothing left for you to hold on to. Not even your pride." I closed the case and walked away. But as I reached the door of the solarium, I saw a woman standing in the hallway, watching me. It wasn't a resident. It was a young woman in a sharp professional suit. She was holding a digital recorder. "Mrs. Sterling?" she asked. "I'm from the Financial Times. We received an anonymous tip about the Vanguard restructuring. Do you have a comment on the allegations of a 30-year fraud at the heart of Sterling Logistics?" I looked at the woman. I looked back at David, who was staring at the canary. I realized then that Evelyn wasn't the only one who had been keeping a suitcase. And the person who sent the tip hadn't been David or Miller. It had been Claire. The daughter-in-law I had saved was already carving out her own piece of the wreckage. The journalist's digital recorder was a small silver eye, blinking with the same hungry rhythm as the security panel back at the house. I looked at her, then past her at the manicured silence of the hallway. I felt the weight of the attaché case in my hand, the physical record of a 30-year surveillance. "Mrs. Sterling?" the journalist prompted, her pen hovering. Is it true? Was the foundation of this empire built on a theft from your own father? I didn't blink. I didn't reach for my pearls. I simply looked at her, with the calm, terrifying clarity of a woman who had already seen the end of the world. The foundation wasn't built on a theft, I said, my voice steady and cold. It was built on a misconception. My husband and son believed that because I chose to be silent, I had nothing to say. They believed that because I was the one who made the house a home, I didn't know how to be the one who made it a business. If there is a fraud here, it's the idea that a woman can be invisible for 30 years without learning exactly how the room is built. I walked past her. I didn't give her a quote. I gave her the truth of my exit. I drove back to the house that was no longer a prison, but a museum of things I had survived. The police tape at the back gate was fluttering in the breeze, a bright yellow scar on the landscape. I went inside and walked straight to the library. I sat at the mahogany desk, David's desk. I opened the attaché case one last time. I pulled out the final PI report, the one from yesterday. I look at the photos of myself in the garden, wearing that old gray sweater. And then I turned to the very back of the file, to the billing invoice that David had conveniently overlooked in his panic. The invoice wasn't addressed to David Sterling. It wasn't paid for by Sterling Logistics. The client listed was MS Trust. My name. I sat back in the leather chair, the silence of the house finally feeling like a victory. The twist wasn't that David had been following me. The twist was that I had been the one paying the investigators for 20 years. I had known David was a thief since 1998. I had known he had stolen the software from my father. But I also knew that if I had confronted him then, he would have used his power to silence me, to take Julian, and to strip my father of his remaining dignity. So I did the only thing a silent woman can do. I became the ghost he expected. I hired the investigators to follow me, but I instructed them to leave the reports where David would accidentally find them. I let him think he was the predator. I fed him a steady diet of my own perceived weakness. Every time he read a report about me sitting in the park or visiting the grave, his ego grew more bloated, more confident. He became so sure of my invisibility that he stopped looking at the bank accounts I was quietly diverting. He stopped looking at the board members I was befriending. He stopped looking at the very empire he thought he was guarding. I had spent 30 years letting him watch a woman who didn't exist so that I could build the woman who did. There was a soft knock on the library door. Claire stepped in. She had changed into one of my silk blouses, and she was holding a glass of wine. She looked at the desk, at the papers, and at me. "The journalist called me, Martha," she said, her voice smooth and calculating. "She's going to run the story about the 1998 theft. It's going to tank the Sterling name. But Vanguard will stay clean if we frame it as you being the whistleblower who finally had enough." She sat across from me, leaning forward. "We can run this company together, Martha. You have the shares, and I have the optics. We can turn the burden into a brand." I looked at Claire. I saw the hunger in her eyes. The same hunger I had seen in Julian and David. She thought she was the successor to the throne. She thought that because I had saved her, I was looking for a partner. "You tipped off the journalist, Claire," I said. She didn't deny it. She just smiled. "It was the only way to ensure the legacy didn't drag you down with it. I was protecting you." "No," I said, pulling a final document from the case. You were protecting your interest in the redundant asset list. You thought if you burned David and Julian, you'd be the only one left standing next to me. I slid the document across the desk. It was a termination of parental and marital support, coupled with a non-disclosure agreement. You're leaving, Claire, I said. You have 1 hour to pack that battered suitcase you brought from the guest house.
I've already authorized a settlement that will keep you comfortable for a year.
After that, you're on your own. You can't do that, Claire snapped, the power red of her personality finally showing through. I'm the only witness you have. If I change my story, that SEC letter is just a piece of paper. I don't need a witness, Claire. I have the digital trail of every cent Julian moved, and I have the signed confessions from Miller. I didn't save you because I needed you. I saved you because I wanted you to see exactly what happens when you underestimate the woman in the room. I stood up. I looked at the gray cardigan I had draped over the back of the chair, the depressing sweater that had been my camouflage for 3 decades. I spent 30 years being the person everyone else needed me to be, I said. And in that time, I learned that the most dangerous person in the world is the one you've forgotten is there. Claire looked at the settlement papers, then back at me. She saw the iron behind the lace. She saw that there was no more room for scavengers in this house. She signed the papers without another word and walked out, her heels finally silent on the carpet. I was alone. I walked to the fireplace and tossed the gray cardigan into the cold hearth. I took the gold Zippo I had taken from Julian and flicked it. The flame was small, but steady. I dropped it onto the wool. I watched the burden catch fire. The smoke rose in a thin gray ribbon, smelling of old wool and lavender. I watched until there was nothing left but a pile of ash. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. The house was quiet. The silence was absolute. But for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like a weight. It felt like an invitation. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had kept in my head since I was 22 years old. Sarah? I said when the lawyer answered.
It's Martha. File the letter. All of them. And Sarah? Tell the gardener he can start on the new roses tomorrow. I want the ones that grow in the dark. I hung up. I sat in the darkness of the library, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. David thought he was watching me. Julian thought he was replacing me. Claire thought she was managing me. They were all wrong. I wasn't the burden. I was the architect. And I had finally finished the blueprints for the rest of my life.